Alan's here. Hi, everybody. Very intimate gathering today, but a very, all the important people are here. So thanks all for joining us this Friday for our fortnightly tech talk. It's kind of a week where I think we're going to do a little bit of it's a bit early for Christmas stockings, Lizzie, but not too early for Dan to be away because he's having his Christmas lunch. So you just got Lizzie and me today with my good friend Simon Carter, who we'll be introducing in a little while as well. Before we kick off, just pay respects to the traditional owners on the land on which we're all meeting. I'm on Gadigal land. Wherever you are, recognise the land was never ceded and paying respects. Because it's kind of intimate today and a little bit, I think you'll find it's a little bit unstructured. Really encourage people to get in the chat. And if you've got something to say, I'm sure Dylan will when we talk about the media code, but if you've got something to say, pipe up, because this is a space where we're working through tough issues. So what we thought we'd do in terms of agenda was kind of like I picked one, Lizzie picked one, we invited Simon, and we've invited some of the guys from Monash for their last of their presentations from the projects they've been doing for Centre for Responsible Technology. So I thought first quarter, let's just talk about where the media bargaining code's up to, the significance of that and a few of the moving pieces this week. Then we're going to talk to Simon, who runs what he calls the Sustainable Digitisation Project. And we're going to talk a little bit with him about how he's using his understanding of the property sector and built environment to think through some of the similar issues that we're going through, which is the way that we're using technology to shape our future and how we can have a bit more control over it. I think, Lizzie, you picked for this week the special topic of workplace surveillance and some of the working from home bits. And then the Monash guys are talking about the way that students may be giving up more than just their time when they're studying. So that feels like a pretty interesting agenda. How are you, Lizzie? It seems weird that just like tag teaming while our friend's having lunch, but it's good to see you and happy Friday.
Yeah, Dan gets to have a day off every so often, I think, from the constant pummeling by you and me, probably more me. I think he's probably relieved to have a lunch where he's not told off for having various opinions. So yeah, I hope he's enjoying himself. Yeah, but we're great in Melbourne. We're enjoying a quadruple donut day.
28 days. That kind of works, doesn't it?
Yep, effectively eliminated. So I hope everyone's eaten 4 donuts today, because there's now no new cases, no community transmission, no one being managed. It's all very exciting. Yeah.
Everyone introduce yourselves in the chat too, because some of you got some fantastic contributions to make. Well, let's talk about the last couple of weeks. So probably the biggest bit of legislation in terms of this space for a number of years is slowly making its way into the parliament. So we've been banging on about the media bargaining code for some time. We understand it will land in the parliament next week. There are the people that have been briefed, and I'm not one of them, have had to sign an NDA. So it's kind of that there have been groups briefed, particularly media players. And I think some of the other players, ironically, neither the opposition or the Greens have been briefed, but it appears that the basic proposition that Rod Sims put forward in his ACCC inquiry, that there would be a mechanism to force an agreement between Google and Facebook and news organisations to value their news will land. The mechanism that Sims put forward, that the what he calls, I think, a final, most reasonable final offer provision will be the framework, which means each side makes an offer and the one that is deemed by an independent assessor most reasonable is the one that lands, which I think is regarded as a framework for reasonableness and good behaviour rather than ambit claims. And I'm interested in talking to you in a sec, Lizzie, about that as a legal principle and if you've seen it anywhere else. But the big development is that it appears that while the original proposition the government put forward was that ABC and SBS wouldn't be part of this code, they will now be included, which was something that the other media players actually supported, because the idea that you would have one section of the media having content that was valued and had to be subject to a code, another side that had information that was free, just kind of didn't make sense. So take all that detail away. We're a week away from legislation, which would, I think, for the first time anywhere in the world, have a legal mechanism to force Google and Facebook to pay for news. It's likely to be a substantial quantum that will fund substantial investment in journalism. Now, yes, it will also deliver substantial money to News Limited, which makes a few of us want to have a shower, but it will also deliver significant funding to Guardian, New Daily, some of the new startups as well. I think the threshold is 150 grand in turnover, which is really anything that employs more than one staff. So a potential game changer. Obviously very contentious. Google and Facebook are still fighting all the way. They came out this week on their platform with a statement from Vince Cerf, who's regarded as one of the, do we say fathers of the internet or inventors of the internet? Although his job now is Google's chief internet evangelist, which is a fantastic job title if anyone wants to find a way of getting paid for that, who basically is saying that this, what does he say? The bargaining code is not, is an intervention that would distort access to information and disadvantage Australians who rely on Google to share their voices and run their business. So there's still a little bit of a concern. Well, the threat is still there from Google that they will review their services, from Facebook that they will shut news entirely. So it's going to be interesting, and a little bit of a whole lot of grand narratives coming together in the National Parliament with a hope and expectation from the government they can get the legislation through before Christmas, which also seems like a bit of a long shot. So that's where we're at. I know I've probably been a little bit more obsessive about this than you, Lizzie, but what's your take on this?
Yeah, well, so I mean, you got a few questions in there. The first one was talking about the idea of arbitration, really. I mean, it's arbitration, perhaps not in name, although we'll see what the actual legislation or the bill proposes. But yeah, this is kind of a common thing that's used in legal agreements. You might have two international companies coming together for some kind of joint venture. They might build into the contract a form of arbitration rather than having to resort to a court. I'm always jealous of barristers and lawyers who work in arbitration, because they're often flying off to Paris for 3 days to appear at an arbitration and then come home because they've got some clients who are engaged in some international joint venture. So it's kind of common in that space, but it is also creeping into all sorts of other agreements in really negative ways, in my view. So there was, people might remember that Equifax was involved in a data breach. They've actually just settled that. I was reading about that this year, but with a bunch of interesting outcomes, which we can talk about another time. But one of the things that is increasingly trying to be done by companies when they might have done something like breach their obligations to users in terms of data is to put in a forced arbitration clause, which prevents you then litigating the proceeding in an open court. So that's part of the agreement that you might have with a company by, signing up to say that you've been affected by the breach. So there's ways in which, in a very often in American contracts, it's being used to try and prevent people getting access to their rights, to try and then determine how the conflict might resolve on the terms of the most powerful entity. But yeah, I'm not surprised that it's here, because clearly you have a situation where these two entities, a media company and one of these platforms, might not agree, but the government really wants this procedure to work. So it sits there as a stopgap measure to avoid a situation where you get into a dispute that can't be resolved. So eventually then the most reasonable offer will be the one that's adopted. And that, I think, is a way in which you can resolve these disputes quickly and efficiently without having to, say, go to court about what is considered fair and the expense associated with that. I have obviously strong feelings about this media code. Digital Rights Watch has put in a submission about it. We've talked about it here many times. Obviously, one of the outstanding issues was whether SBS and ABC would be included, because they were excluded, which it's not clear why. There was at different points it was perceived as an oversight, but then also potentially compromising the independence of those two media organisations. What I would say is I'm a bit troubled by it. I mean, I think the ABC is underfunded, like most people, I'm sure, in this room. But I am worried about entrenching a system in which media companies, now including the state broadcasters, are encouraged to attract revenue through a data-driven mode of operating. I mean, it's not just that the money will come in, but it's also access to different types of knowledge about how these platforms work that will be will be an outcome of being a participant in this code. And, ultimately my worry is that this as a source of revenue will be perceived as an alternative way to fund these organisations then, and justify a claim that they don't need further government funding. And I think that's really the issue here. We need to properly fund our public broadcasters, and that really should come out of tax revenue. It's a widely popular proposal. The coalition government doesn't do it for its own political reasons. And I don't want to be giving them more fodder to justify that kind of approach, because it does deplete our democracy. So that's my main worry. I'm glad they're not left out in the cold, but I do think we should be careful what we wish for here.
Yeah, I think there's two bits there, Lizzie. The first is whether this actually keeps driving more data-driven journalism, or if it actually takes the pressure off for eyeballs. So the way I'm looking at this isn't that it's a straight, so this, it'll all be in the doing. So what is the value of news, and is it just in terms of that mediation, arbitration, whatever you call it? Will it be determined by having to prove in marketing speak value, or will it be a broader look at the value of social networks when they cover news? Because I think part of the hit has been that the platforms say, well, it doesn't actually earn us that much money. Whereas I guess, not just media agencies, but I think the body politic says, well, unless you have this content, then the network's a lot less than it would be. So if you can land, I suspect that this will become a de facto for a tax on big tech, because they've just proven so good at avoiding tax, and the government has seemed to either, there's been a little bit of talk around Google taxes and whatnot, but to actually get the right hit for the contribution Australians are making to these companies hasn't happened. So I guess there's one way of looking that this is actually a transfer of value from platforms to new media, which regardless of the mechanism will actually create a more vibrant public square, and that's a good thing. The second piece is, will it just be a zero-sum game for the ABC, so that any money that comes in will just be cut off government funding? And that's the political issue that I do think we need to be vigilant about. The ABC has said that any money they do get will go straight into regional journalism, which is interesting, because then if that leads to a cut in other services, it will be clear that there is actually a reduction in services. And obviously investing in regional journalism is incredibly popular for some Conservative MPs. So it's not, I find this fascinating because it's not linear. And I actually think that the other bit I think is interesting is this has multi-partisan support at the moment. Like, I think there will be, there may well be pushed into Senate and interrogating it, but basically the government, Labor, the Greens are all up for this as a model. And that doesn't happen very often. So I kind of feel that what's going on here is an attempt by the political system to construct a better way of, supporting democracy. And I think that's a good thing. Maybe I'm naive, but I do think this is a moment that is really significant.
I'm not, look, I understand the difficulties in taxing large tech companies. I mean, you end up essentially picking a trade war with the United States of sorts, which is a problem, or I think it's a problem we need to tackle. But I can also understand why looking for shortcuts around that is an appealing prospect, and this is one of them. France has got a different regime where they propose taxing revenue of these companies rather than profits, which I think is a good one, but that did result in quite a bit of animosity towards President Trump at the time, and I do wonder whether you might get a different outcome under someone like President Biden. But what I suppose, I don't disagree with you, but I think we have to really come to terms with the fact that the public broadcaster needs to be properly funded, and that money needs to go into various areas of their work with an intent. And we shouldn't just assume that because previous forms of commercial media were funded by advertising, that in the future that's how media has to be funded, because that's the logic behind this, that essentially advertising dollars have gone from commercial media into the hands of tech companies, and really what we're trying to do is claw some of that back, which I think is missing the opportunity here to look at alternative ways of funding these organisations, and alternative ways of avoiding tech companies extracting such enormous value from society without giving what's needed back. Because I think the other side of this debate that is discussed perhaps less is that these tech companies really, I think, are on the nose with many people. You know, Google, I think, is overplaying its hand in relation to this issue. They talk about how they've provided a lot of funding into journalism already, and that's quite clearly, I think, a way of avoiding something like this evolving. And they're trying to invest now in avoiding Australia becoming the first country that kind of it constructs this model. And even if it doesn't work, or in some ways it does work in other ways, that it might then be adopted in other countries around the world. So I think that they've got a very difficult role to play, but I'm not sure they're doing a very good job of it. And I think there's a real problem. Well, the problem is, I think a lot of people now agree these companies have too much power. They're being a net negative on things like diversity of cultural and media content. The question is, what do we do about that? And I sort of wish we had a different solution than what was on offer. But I think that it's very easy to push things like this through because the tech companies have been for so long neglecting, I think, to address this very serious problem.
Yeah, and you know, let's not be naive. The reason this is going through is because News Corp and the 9 Fairfax Group, which is now chaired by a former Liberal treasurer, need it. But that doesn't mean it's wrong either. Like, it kind of, I've spoken about the Venn diagram before. Just because these guys want it doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. To your point, you know, Dylan's made the point in the chat and a few that why do you need an advertising model to underpin journalism? I think that is right, but I think what's being proposed here is a more elegant solution than just advertising. And my concern is that if we end up with just saying we need to raise taxes or spend more public money on journalism, then we're caught in the boring old debates, which will never become multi-partisan because, you know, higher taxes, lower taxes, it's just, you know, it's political kryptonite. So it's not perfect. It's being driven by the ACCC, which is all about making markets work. Their brief is not the broader public interest. The broader public interest is almost incidental. I think it's been interesting how broadly Sims has gone in interpreting his brief through this process. But, you know, at the end of the day, in a week's time, Australia might be ground zero for at least putting a little stake in the ground against these big companies. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's just one more thing I would add into this conversation, which is, you know, we talked a bit about who needs who here. You know, do broadcasters need social media companies more than social media companies need traditional broadcasters? And, you know, if you do look, there's some interesting stuff coming out of the US election, but, you know, there's been a couple of journos who are tracking the most popular pages or posts on Facebook over this period, and that it's in fact much more people like Ben Shapiro, an alt-right figure who largely, you know, participates in the mainstream media, but has his own channels, goes direct to viewers, than it is, say, someone like Tucker Carlson, who's probably the most popular kind of commentator in the US, who's on Fox News. And in fact, it's interesting to watch those two, how they can are as popular as each other, but one certainly figures larger in the mind of the public, I think, Tucker Carlson, because he's on a traditional broadcaster. And in fact, there are a lot of people, you know, Facebook is so powerful in terms of dictating who will be winners and losers in terms of media content distribution. And that's a question that I think we really need to come to terms with, rather than, say, tinkering around the edges. Like, this isn't going to deal with the problem of, you know, right-wing extremism being incentivized by a platform like Facebook that goes outside traditional broadcast methods. If we want investigative journalism, and that's kind of the idea, we want a robust media that can do
civic accountability, you know.
Exactly. That can hold politicians, hold power accountable. Exactly. So whether it's investigative or day-to-day, that's work that needs to be funded. And I don't think we can ever assume that anything like this will address that problem, which is not going away and is extremely large. And some transparency around that, I think, would be much more helpful than just a code where changes to the algorithm on Facebook is shared with these media organisations, rather than making it a public discussion about what we want from these online spaces, what we need from a robust media, and then working out how we can make those two match, which I think is a much larger, much more urgent problem.
Indeed. Let's totally change it now, because I feel that we spent many hours talking about this and we end up in kind of, I think the same place, which is summary, yes, and not end of story. And I think, very much that there are a whole bunch of other initiatives that are now starting to roll out, again, from a Conservative government. The review of data protection that's currently being undertaken by AG's department. There's a review into disinformation going on. And I think Amy sent through today that I think there's also a review of television content coming out through the Department of Communications. So there are a lot of moving pieces, but the fact that we've got a Conservative government that's regulating, I think, is a really interesting first step. I feel like I've just dictated. That's the end of that bit. So sorry. If people want to make a comment, keep going in the chat. I see Christiani has just said advertising still needed because only a tiny minority of people subscribe to news products, which is kind of true. Do you want to have a quick chat? Because I saw, I think Zareen, can you call up Christiani if she's there, or Christanthe? If you want to have a chat.
Hello, how you going?
Hello, how are you going?
Good. I've got a bit of a broken leg, which is why I was on. So yeah, I think that it's just, so I am from the Centre for Media Transition at UTS, and I think it is important to acknowledge that this is a transition. I completely agree that there are other models to fund journalism, and I have used those other models in the past myself, but we are in a space where the vast majority of journalism is not being supported in terms of subscription. And the biggest problem that online actually created for journalism was the loss of classifieds. Those were the rivers of gold. That's what kept journalism going. And that's all gone online. The Fairfax selling domain, Fairfax selling, that was actually the dumbest decision they ever made. Mm. So there needs to be that broader public discussion that Lizzie was talking about before we can get people understanding that actually, if we don't do something different as a society, journalism isn't going to survive. And we are in this period where we haven't had that understanding in society more broadly. And so we do need to claw back some advertising dollars.
Yeah, and I suspect that's one of the problems that Sims was trying to sort of resolve in the first instance. So thanks for that contribution, Christiani. I'm going to call Simon up now because we're going to totally change the pace and talk a little bit about how you create ethical digital cities as business and property makes that whole transition to becoming smart and collecting information when people enter their premises and all that data swirling around. So Simon, thanks for joining us. I know you've been sort of dropping in every now and then into the chat over the last few months, and we've had a few one-on-one discussions. Do you want to give people a bit of an overview of the problem you're trying to solve and the approach that you've been taking to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. It's always good to chat with you and nice to do it with a few extra friends today. Look, by way of background, I specialise in sustainability, heavily in the built environment and with the property sector. I've been at it for a long time, and over the last back to 2014, realised that digitalisation was going to be hugely consequential in that space. And where we find ourselves now is sort of the convergence of a whole load of very interesting drivers. If we sort of pick up on the last conversation, which largely pointed to surveillance capitalism as Zuboff frames it, in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, she talks about the rush to sort of mine and control data has to date largely having happened in the online space. And now it's really turning to the physical environment and the built environment. So we're sort of at that point. But we're also at a point where suddenly we have a tremendous amount of remarkable technologies available in the built environment, and both a lot of commercial opportunity with that. So if you're a major property group, a REIT, a listed REIT, you need to compete in the market to offer up more sophisticated buildings for tenants or for customers in a shopping center, or it might be office or it might be industrial. It's sort of across the board, and you're being offered more and more very interesting technological solutions. At the same time, and perhaps catalyzed by what has been happening in the online space, and sort of little alarms beginning to trigger, we're seeing all sorts of stakeholders beginning to ask questions around that. And it might be the community itself observing what is happening with surveillance states in the world. Maybe what has happened in Hong Kong. I know we spoke about that in this forum a while ago. They may be feeling slightly weird when they go into shopping centres and they get offered a whole load of information that they didn't realise they had solicited. We're seeing investors beginning to recognise that this stuff can affect investment value, and so raising questions. And by that it might be cyber security and safety for people in properties, or it may be the address of human rights, such as privacy, and also sort of building users, as the systems and buildings become more and more sophisticated, using biometrics to enter buildings. People are asking questions. So we've sort of suddenly arrived at this very interesting juncture. And I should add that some cities, administering large precincts of our built environment are concerned about the effects of this sort of stuff on their constituents. Where does the public-private boundary start and stop in cities as we walk around now with more surveillance technology, for example? So
do you reckon the sector just sees it as an opportunity, or are they seeing it as a risk, or are they seeing it as a moral issue?
Well, they're seeing it as both, and that's what we're trying to navigate with the Sustainable Digitalisation Project. So we look at the double-edged sword nature of this, right? On one hand, we have extraordinary technology, and there's no two ways about it. We'll deploy more and more and more of it in the built environment, and for many great benefits, including environmental, social, and governance ones. And we can talk about some of those if you like. But there's some very serious downside risks, some of which will play out downstream or further into time. And so we're awakening to that reality right now and trying to approach it. And the Sustainable Digitalisation Project is just this growing collaboration of stakeholders in that space coming together to try and navigate this.
What do you reckon, Lizzie?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. I think growing influence of the Internet of Things. I think Lucy from Digital Rights Watch sent me, I saw a link she posted the other day where someone said they were vacuuming and they couldn't vacuum because the internet was down and they had a vacuum cleaner that was connected to the internet. And you just sort of realise the practical implications of connecting so many things to the internet. But one of the things I was going to talk about was, one of the campaigns we've run is to talk about smart cities and making sure digital cities, or the use of digital technology in cities, doesn't become a tool of surveillance either, and that you do need to have citizens participating in some of this decision making, so that at the very least transparency and accountability around some of these decisions, so that people get to realise, I suppose, that their lived environment, their built environment, has the potential to use technology that can both empower them and create a place of flourishing, but also surveil them and control them. And I wonder what you think about that. How do you bring people who are citizens into these discussions about the lived environment? Because that kind of campaign around digital cities is something that has got international attention. There's a UN kind of body that's set up to push a particular set of principles in relation to it that favour human rights. I'm kind of curious to know, Simon, what you think about bringing in stakeholders as when they're citizens and how you do that effectively.
Well, that's a very good question. I interviewed a remarkable person a couple of weeks ago. She was on the front line of what I call the community resistance to Sidewalk Toronto. For those who aren't familiar with this remarkable case study, Sidewalk Labs is the urban analytics group under Alphabet. So it's kind of the urban sister company to Google.
Google, yeah.
And they're looking to develop pieces of city or whole cities. They're very ambitious, recognize obviously the power of built environment data, the value of it. And so they managed to create a situation with the city of Toronto to develop a piece of the Toronto Portlands, massive piece of real estate on the front of Toronto, one of the best development sites in North America. And it was very ambitious in terms of smarts and offered some pretty remarkable social benefits and environmental benefits. But there was a considerable community backlash. And chatting to Sadia a couple of weeks ago, she's still pretty tired after 2.5 weeks in this negotiation. She really framed it as it was an extraordinary learning lab. And she said when her group sat down at the table at the beginning of 2.5 years of sort of discussion and arm wrestling, the language was completely misaligned. And often with this case study, we talk about the asymmetry of knowledge. But she said, we would sit there and try and explain these issues to Sidewalk Labs and others, and they did not understand what we were trying to say. It and actually took a very long time to create a common language in order to really be able to work this through. And if you start thinking further back down the line, you come to issues of digital literacy. So before we can even effectively participate in the urgent conversations needed to shape the digital physical world that we're creating, we need to empower the community to be able to participate in those. So look, I don't have a kind of a really good answer to your question, Lizzie, but we are seeing more sort of lived laboratories like the Sidewalk Toronto case study, which will hopefully guide us with that. But I think it's urgent.
Yeah.
We can't take 10 years to do this.
I would point out as well, there's a former employee of Sidewalk Labs on the transition team for Biden, which fills me with a bit of nerves actually, because I do think the model tends to be, act first, ask for permission later. And that's pretty troubling when both you have a population which is there's a deliberate discouragement of obtaining critical digital literacy, but also companies that are very ambitious and very keen to establish the rules before others have a say. And I think some of these initiatives around cities for digital rights are great. I would just like to see greater take up and a kind of a movement within people who are interested in the built environment towards supporting those initiatives as well.
That kind of segues into your special subject today, Lizzie, which is what Microsoft's been doing with work from home software. Do you want to just sort of take people through that logic? I think it kind of jumps off the city to the workplace, and to Simon's point about digital literacy, like starting conversations on people's laptops is probably a pretty good place to start.
Yeah, well, I think it's just really interesting because there's a couple of commentators who've been talking about this, but the idea that you might be able to use Microsoft not just to do word processing and office tasks and the like, but to actually also surveil your employees. And this has become more pronounced, obviously, as we all work from home. So there's a greater incentive to watch what your employees are doing. But to take a step back, I think there was this assumption with the digital revolution that robots would eat all the jobs. That's how it was talked about, that automation would mean that there were fewer jobs to go around. And I think that myth's largely been debunked, but I think what there is kind of one aspect of workplace culture that is getting eaten by robots, which is management, that in fact we are automating processes of management much more. And so you're less accountable to a manager that you might have a personal relationship with and much more accountable to a machine. So Microsoft 365 now offers all these kinds of analytical tools based not just upon your workplace's performance, but also in comparison to other workplaces' performance around things like whether you've sent emails, whether you're in touch with different people across the organization, how many meetings you went to, essentially to map out what they understand to be your productivity, which of course may not map at all with what is actually considered to be productivity or what is actually considered valuable and important in a workplace, but can be very persuasive. And we've seen lots of instances of that where tools for automated forms of management can have very serious consequences for the workers involved, especially when those who are employing them don't take the time to deal with people as individuals and as humans who contribute things in different ways, and instead outsource this to machines and algorithms who make these decisions. So this is a huge issue. It's, you know, like surveillance in the built environment, surveillance in the workplace is only becoming more and more prevalent, and there's, you know, the laws are not at all catching up with that. And I suppose I just wanted to make the point that it's not just something that happens in, you know, in non-white collar industries, because there's often an assumption that's the case. You use cameras, you use tracking devices on cars and the like, but actually this is now how you engage in work, and there's all sorts of ways in which these companies are trying to optimize this process of management. I did want to bring in Lauren Kelly if I could, because she works at the United Workers Union. She did a great submission. There was a recent inquiry onto this issue of workplace surveillance and technology, that, you know, looking at how it is a really important issue and that we need to legislate to change it. And her submission I thought was great because it's got a bunch of different suggestions about what you could do in the alternative. I don't know if she's managed to be unmuted.
Yeah. Thanks, Lizzie. Hi, everyone. Hi, Peter. Yeah, Lizzie's already made so many great points. Like, you know, when we talk about technology and the future of work, the narrative for some years now has been about how robots are going to displace us and human labor will become redundant. But it's almost turning out to be kind of worse than that, you know, because it's not even that kind of post-scarcity model now. It's more a case of technology being imposed upon the labour process in such a way to just drive down the quality of work and the security of work, but not actually displacing human labour and automating in ways that could be emancipatory. And what I've found through my own research is this connection between really precarious employment models and technology is really significant. And the most egregious uses of surveillance and, you know, over-the-top management practices are always linked to really insecure working arrangements, right? For all the obvious reasons, because it's fundamentally about extracting more value from your workers and imposing power from above. And these new kind of, not new, but this real amplification at the moment of algorithmic management and new ways of managing the labour process through platforms and things like that, that kind of obscure traditional management structures, is causing workers so much grief. You know, like, whereas before, even trying to negotiate some of these tensions that are inherent within the working relationship with someone you at least have a relationship with is something you can you can strategize around and you can have a chance of having a conversation about. But, you know, we're seeing, just as one example, in the US now, gig delivery drivers for Target, even their incomes are being determined by an algorithm that somehow determines how much effort they're putting in. So they've got these black box pay structures that are unaccountable to anybody, and there's really not clear what kind of recourse workers can take if they have a problem with it, because no one even knows how the income's being determined ostensibly, because it's just all black boxed in that way. And yeah, like, a lot of workers in my union, members of our union, report just how frustrating it is that you've got all these structures of hierarchy, and at least before you kind of knew who the people in HR were, and now they just like don't even have a clue about who's deciding these things that have these massive impacts upon their lives. And of course there are still people behind the scenes, but in terms of trying to negotiate those things in an effective way, it just becomes really difficult and really obscured. And I think people working from home at the moment and still working in their regular jobs, in a lot of sites, like in production, for instance, workers on the floor were still going into the factory or the industrial cleaning lab or whatever the case may be, but management was working from home. And so there's been this really interesting like divide between the kind of brains of the operation and the hands, as they often are referred to. And it's just like this hark back to earliest 20th century kind of time and motion studies, Taylorism on the floor.
And of course, it's also, we saw this week the revelations of how Amazon's also using the surveillance to track union activity. I know it's, I think it's Black Friday today, which is this big sales day. And I know a lot of Amazon unions around the world are trying to raise a bit of attention to some of those practices as well, for one of the companies that really did well out of the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same for a lot of warehouses here. And I think what in the Australian context, at a time now with rising unemployment, the issue of underemployment is going to be really, really important. And when you have a situation like that where the cost of job loss is very high, the kind of propensity for employers to impose greater work intensification, greater surveillance, and greater pressure on workers in general is really amplified. And using some of these tools, it's not totally necessary, but it certainly extends the scope and the ease of surveillance, especially in remote settings.
Yeah, because I would say as well, like, I think people, if you've not worked in an Amazon factory, which I haven't, but I think a lot of people who cover Amazon in the press often haven't, but it's a very tightly managed workplace. There's a great book, sorry, I can hear something in my background, right on the street. There's a great book, I think it's called, I'll find a link to it and post it in there, but where a woman who is a journalist goes and works in an Amazon factory and then writes about it. But in terms of management, you have no spare time. You're assigned tasks via a handheld device. You have no time to sit down and relax. All your bathroom breaks are monitored. It's a very tightly managed workplace. So people assume these are gig workers, or, Uber is the other example, which of course I know a bit about from my day job, but, people think that that's independent contractors having the flexibility to choose their own time. But actually the platform does control how you work. You can't just log on and log off as you choose. You can't reject jobs easily. So you are much more managed than I think the impression is often for people who haven't worked in that environment. And it's a form of surveillance, it's a form of management, but it's extremely awful, I think, to work in that way. It's dehumanizing and really soul destroying. And that's what a lot of people talk about who do this kind of work. And so it's a qualitatively different relationship with management that you might have had in the past. Obviously it limits how you can organize and stuff, but it's also just a very dehumanizing experience to have to deal with your boss in that way. And I think it's important to remember that, rather than thinking about this just as users, but also the people who are supporting this kind of economy.
So thanks, Lauren, for dropping in. I'd love to keep talking about this for the rest of it, but we have got one more section that we need to get to. So we've talked about the city, we've talked about the workplace, and now we're going to talk about the classroom. And we've got Felicia and who's Felicia and her friend? Alice.
Alice.
Who are going to do a present. As some of you know, we've been working with Monash Masters of Strategic Comms and Rugja's team and all their students were doing projects around issues of technology and surveillance. And so the best ones were given the opportunity to present to a tech talk. So I think this is our third presentation, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you guys. So happy to hand the floor over to you if you want to. I'm sure you've got a very impressive deck to take us through. But hi, guys, and do you want to just give people a bit of an overview of what brought you to do this particular topic?
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for the floor. Today, me and my team, we're going to present what we have researched for the Center for Responsible Technology, specifically for the Healthy Digital Child Foundation program. And I'm Felicia. On behalf of our team, Alice and I will be presenting our report. So as you may know, every day, people are becoming more and more dependent on the internet and digital technologies, exposing more and more hidden privacy risk. This is especially concerning within children, as digital technologies have been increasingly involved in the education system. This leads to our project title, which is the use of digital technology in schools and its impacts on children's privacy in Australia, United States, and Singapore. Education technologies are highly used in these three developed countries, yet the government's policies and regulations vary. Our report's objective is to show the need for better children's data protection through improved policies and digital intelligence. Starting with Australia, personal data is protected by the Privacy Act 1988. It serves to govern individuals' rights under a principle-based approach. This act applies to all individuals rather than being child-specific and predominantly depends on implied consent. Regulations also vary in each Australian state and territory. Personal information is governed by either legislative or administrative schemes according to the region. These acts aim to protect the personal information of users and provide statutory guidance. However, these regulations have unclear definitions of personal information and lack of executions when privacy is violated. Education departments and schools have established practices and guidelines regarding software assessment. For instance, the eSafety Commissioner has developed an eSafety toolkit to inspect new technologies and software through safety evaluation tools and checklists. Schools are increasingly using apps that differ from traditional education suites to aid remote learning for students during the pandemic. However, both of these educational apps are normally untested. This increases children's risk in exposing to personal data. Moving on to the United States, there are three major federal policies related to the use of technology in schools. Firstly, Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act, which deals with the right to access and control access to personal information. The next one is Children Online Privacy Protection Act, which applies to children aged 13 and under and deals directly with data collected from students' interactions on the internet. The third one would be the 1978 Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, which applies to K-12 students. It aims to ensure that schools are able to disclose information only with the written consent of parents before children can participate in an investigation, analysis, or evaluation by Department of Education. However, even with the existence of US policies regarding child protection, a study suggested that students' private data is not handled well, as it is often sold in student lists to universities and other parties. Shown is the table from a Fordham University paper demonstrating some of the data available for purchase on student lists. This is such as citizenship, race, ethnicity, religion, and disabilities. And the last one will be Singapore. And the Singaporean government implemented the Personal Data Protection Act, or PDPA 2012. This is to regulate the usage, collection, and disclosure of personal data by organizations. This act also protects personal information in both electronic and non-electronic forms. Similar to Australia's Privacy Act, the PDPA 2012 does not include specific provisions on children's data protection. Driven by the success of Europe's GDPR, the PDPA is currently in the process of a policy reform to raise data privacy standards. Singaporean children obtained their first electronic gadget at 8, making them the youngest to go online worldwide. This is because the government strongly supports the growth of children's technology utilization, such as the ICT Master Plan established in 1997 to encourage the ICT use in education. Under this project, teachers are given training regarding technology-enhanced learning, while students are provided very affordable notebook computers and internet access by schools. I'm going to pass the presentation to Alice now.
Thank you for that, Felicia. So our research has led us to several findings about children's privacy at schools with regard to use of digital technology. The first is that policy surrounding this matter varies between countries and even within countries at state level, which has led to an imbalance in what's considered appropriate in respect to children's privacy. We've also found that even within countries that have strict laws about children's data privacy, these laws aren't always adhered to, as mentioned previously about the USA. And these findings have led us to recommendations that we consider necessary for children to be able to have the privacy they deserve. So our group has developed two recommendations to the issues discussed. The first recommendation is to make strict laws that are regularly enforced with significant penalties to encourage the protection of children's data. An example of the kind of law we think appropriate can be seen in Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, which has seen stricter laws and harsher penalties enforced in order to discourage misuse of data by any group. However, we are also aware that there are some limitations to the GDPR, such as consent issues that would need to be addressed to make such law effective in increasing child data privacy. And our second recommendation is compulsory teachings on how to be safe online within school curriculum. If children are taught about digital safety from a young age, many issues surrounding data privacy in schools can be minimised. An example of the kind of teaching we think appropriate can be seen in the DQ Institute's Digital Intelligence Quotient program. And through using the Digital Intelligence Quotient as an archetype, the Australian government could come up with a new educational program that ensures digital intelligence from a young age and so decreases future problems in regard to child data privacy within schools. From this program, we believe both teachers and students would become more mindful of what they do online, leading to a safer classroom environment for the digital age. And that's sort of where we got up to. And thank you so much for listening to our little presentation. We hope you found it informative and given you some insight on how policy change could make such a vital difference for this new digital generation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. That's an excellent contribution. As someone that's got 2 teenage kids, I think the big issue around tech in schools is actually that there was this initial wave. There was just an assumption that more technology would improve educational outcomes, and now there's kind of a recalibration going on, but particularly the discussions around digital literacy and putting some walls around, you know, particularly when you're in an environment where you're getting kids learning on devices, but they're also the families that are responsible for providing those devices. So there's this massive cost transfer onto families, and then no ground rules and no rules in place around it. Lizzie, what do you reckon about the right framework for protecting kids when they're learning online?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting presentation, because often we talk a lot about equipping children with critical digital literacy to be able to enter the 21st century and participate and be conscious, you know, digital consumers, to think about privacy. It's always seen as this kind of something that you're supposed to take responsibility for. You signed up to these T's and C's. And then, you know, when it comes to these kinds of things, before they're even old enough to have a say, we've treated them with quite a bit of disrespect. We've created the assumption that your life will be one in which you're required to hand over data to mysterious entities at all times without being in a position to withdraw your consent. So you can't teach one and also conduct your schooling with the other in place. I think we do need to practice the idea that people have agency, that they should have control over how they enter these digital spaces. They have the right to know what's been known about them and how these relationships work. Not just for the parents, because I understand a lot of parents pull their hair out because it's so difficult to do these things and feel very powerless in these contexts, but also because we're modelling behaviour for children. So I think it is time that we treated children with respect and gave them rights, rather than just as objects that we teach things to using whatever method we like to think is appropriate, heedless to their actual privacy, and then expect them to enter the world as adults and have, you know, their full faculties in terms of critical digital literacy. It just can't be true. So it's really telling for me. I don't have children, but from what you said, it's the sound.
Don't do it.
Very alarming. I'm just shocked that they're treated with such disrespect. Oh, it must be so frustrating.
So Esther had a comment. I don't know if you're there, Esther, about the learning from home experience through this year.
Yes, I'm here. G'day.
Hi.
I've got 2 young children. I was working from home and supporting them with their remote learning. Now, because of some technical and practical reasons, I decided that we'd learn offline. And then I got an email from the school saying, we have to mark you absent because you're not logging in. And it turned out that the school was actually monitoring my children's online presence in our own home and using that in order to mark their attendance. And they were also monitoring my use, my access to the children's learning page to download their learning materials from separate devices. So they could tell what devices we had in our home, when they were getting logged on, and they were using that to mark attendance. And there was no thought to asking the parents for permission or to let us know that that's how that information would be collected about our personal use of devices at home.
That's just mind-blowing.
It's
Simon,
so outrageous. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
Go on.
Simon.
Look, I just wanted to suggest that there's just a tremendous opportunity in this. If we think about environmental sustainability, climate change, or waste and resources, so often we turn to kids and schools as a sort of a real acupuncture point in society for making change. And we have a much broader, challenge with digitalisation. We spoke before about, digital literacy as a prerequisite to bring people into a conversation about how we really want to shape the digitalised world. Yeah, and so to really, as a sort of a society, focus in on this particular problem, schools and sort of more broadly for children, I think has tremendous value, because we'll all learn a hell of a lot through doing so. And if one of the great barriers to engaging people on this is language and communicating in simple terms, focusing on kids in schools will help us a lot with regards to getting that language right.
Yeah, I think there's an assumption that younger generation are really tech savvy in that they know how to work the tech. I think a project of making them, the political economy of tech aware as well is why I've been so thrilled that Magda's taken on this as part of the study of the Monash students. Just one little bright light. My son, who is a total gaming nut and is just like the end of my world, he's now come on. There is a game, and I'll get the name of it next, where you go and you do you break down people doing surveillance capitalism. So the game is actually to break surveillance capitalism. So I'll find the name of it and share it with you guys next week, because it's probably a ripper. But hey, so I don't know if you've got your marks yet, but we give you top marks. Really well done, guys, and thanks for that. And yeah, thanks for your participation through the program, Magda, as well. And look forward to working with you guys again next year. We're coming up to the hour, everyone. We've only got one more of these in a couple of weeks, which will be our end of year party. We've got Human Rights Commissioner Ed Santo joining us. We've got Dan back from lunch. Maybe we should
He might not be back from lunch by then, let's be honest.
We might all make it it's almost a Friday before Christmas. So if you want to bring a drink to the next one, and we'll think about the highlights and lowlights of the year, I reckon by then we'll know whether the media codes land, if nothing else. So thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
Thanks, team. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone, for being part of it. And yeah, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.